First of all, we start with blockout and relief. By definition, blockout is the act of placing wax and other materials into undesirable undercuts on the master cast. We start first with cast preparation. For the maxillary cast, we start a procedure called beading. So the maxillary cast, first of all, is beaded. Beading, by definition, is the act of scraping the outline of the major connector into the maxillary master cast. The bead line, by description, is approximately 0.5 millimeter deep and become less distinct as it approaches the gingival margins. So in this figure, we saw this square outline to represent the beading, and also the anterior and posterior border of the maxillary major connector. The bead line produces a raised edge at the border of the major connector. This raised border ensures positive contact of the major connector with the palatal tissues. This features reduces the packing of the food beneath the maxillary major connector. So in this figure, we saw in this metal framework there is a raised border on the edge and in the middle of the maxillary major connector as a result of the beading of the maxillary cast. Bead lines are not used in the conjunction with the mandibular major connectors. Why? Because these connectors rest on thin gingival tissues, mean the major connector, that cannot tolerate the associated pressures. So the histological makeups of the gingival tissues in the mandibular or the lower arch cannot tolerate the pressure exerted by the bead line if it is present on the mandibular major connector. So we don't use beading in the lower major connector for the construction of removable partial denture. Types of blockouts of master cast. The first type of blockout is the parallel blockout. Parallel blockout used for areas that has been applied or used as a guiding plane surfaces. Also, the parallel blockout used over all undercut areas crossed by the major or minor connectors. For the type of wax used for the parallel blockout, we use hard inlay wax, may also be used as a blockout material. Parallel blockout, as we saw in this figure, used for the proximal tooth surfaces to be used as guiding planes for the insertion and removal of the removable partial denture. Also, the parallel blockout used beneath all the minor connectors component of removable partial denture. Again, parallel blockout used for tissue undercuts to be crossed by the rigid connectors. Parallel blockout also used for tissue undercut to be crossed by the origin of the bar clasp. So the origin of the bar clasp, as we see in this figure, is blocked. Any tissue undercut is blocked by using parallel blockout. Also, parallel blockout used for the deep interproximal surfaces, as we see here, interproximal surfaces of the teeth to be covered by the minor connectors or by the linguoplate metal extensions. So all these surfaces should be blocked out by parallel blockout. Also, parallel blockout are used beneath the bar clasp arm of the gingival surfaces. So the area beneath the bar clasp to the gingival surfaces, which is represent the area of the pathway of the bar clasp, should be blocked out by parallel blockout. For the parallel blockout, all guiding planes area must be parallel to the path of placement, as we said before, and all other area that will be contacted by the rigid parts of the denture framework, mean metal framework, must be made free of any undercut by the procedure of parallel blockout. As we see here, this arrow represents the path of the placement of removable partial denture. So by use this orange color blockout material, we made the surface parallel to the path of a placement, so there will be no interaction with the placement and removal of the metal framework of the removable partial denture. The second type of the blockout procedure is the shape blockout. Shape blockout represented by wax ledge for the reciprocal clasp arm placed as cervical as possible. Also, the wax ledge for the location of the retentive clasp arm. So we place some types of wax in the area cervical to the location of the both reciprocal and retentive clasp arms. The third type of the blockout is the arbitrary blockout. Arbitrary blockout placed on the labial surfaces and the labial undercut which are not involved in the denture design, as we see here by the green area. This area is not involved in the design of the removable partial denture, so it should be blocked out by arbitrary blockout. Also, the sublingual and distolingual areas beyond the limit of the denture design is also blocked out by arbitrary blockout. Now, why we use arbitrary blockout? Arbitrary blockout is done to, number one, facilitate the removal of the cast from the impression during duplication. During the procedure of duplication, to facilitate the removal of the cast from the impression, we use arbitrary blockout. Also, prevent distortion of the duplicating mold when the master cast is removed. We used the arbitrary blockout. Also, all gingival surfaces area are blocked out by arbitrary blockout. Also, gross tissue undercut situated below the area involved in the design of the denture framework means that any tissue undercut situated in areas other than the area involved of the design of the denture framework should be blocked out by arbitrary blockout. Tissue undercut distal to the cast framework, any area, as we said before, the distolingual space or any other tissue undercuts that are away from the cast framework should be blocked out by arbitrary blockout. The labial and buccal, tooth and tissue undercut, again not involved in the denture design. Any area not involved in the denture design, if it is represented by undercuts on the tooth surface, labially or buccally, or on the tissue undercut, should be blocked out by arbitrary blockout. This area and this figure in the orange color represent arbitrary blockout for tissue undercut below the area of the design of the metal framework of the removable partial denture. Now, we said blockout and relief. The second part is the relieving of the master cast. The procedure of placing wax in certain areas on the master cast before we start duplication. The purpose is to create a raised area, mean elevated area, on the refractory cast. Refractory cast is the cast resulted from the procedure of the duplication of the master cast, and we will describe it in details in the next lecture. Now, the purpose of the relieving is to create a raised or elevated areas on the refractory cast. So the purpose of the relief, why there is and why we use relief, to prevent any tissue impingement resulting from the rotation of the denture framework. During functional movement, there is expected some sort of rotation of the metal framework during the function. So if there is any possibility of impingement of the tissue, we use relief to prevent any damage to these tissues as a result of rotation of the denture framework. Also, we use relief to create a space for the acrylic resin beneath the retentive ladders. The retentive ladders in the distal extension or in the area of the edentulous space, there is a space between the metal framework and the tissue surface. This space will be, during the packing of acrylic, be filled with acrylic resin. So the acrylic resin needs space. This space is created by the relief. Now, what are the sites that are used for the relief? First, if there is area in which major connector will contact thin tissues, as we said, to prevent damage to the soft tissue, such as hard area, so frequently found where on the lingual or mandibular ridges, and also in case of elevated palatal raphe and palatal tori on the upper arch. So this area, if it is contacted directly with the metal framework, there will be damage. So this area is relieved in the relief procedure. Also, again, beneath the ladder minor connectors. Why? For the creation of a space for the attachment of the acrylic resin for the packing procedure. In the mandibular major connector, often warrant relief between the rigid metal surface and the underlying soft tissues. As we see here in the lingual side, if there is possibility as a result, as we said, of rotation or functional movement of the metal framework, we need to do some sort of relief in the wax. Relief prevents the margins of the major connector from lacerating or destroying the sensitive lingual mucosa as a result of this functional movement. Now, why we use relief and what are the stage of using relief? The slope of the anterior ridge influences the amount of the relief. If there is vertical dropout of the lingual soft tissues or the lingual ridge, minimal relief is done because there is no possibility of contact between the metal framework and the tissues. But if there is a slope of the tissue toward the tongue, we are talking here lingually, so that require greatest amount of relief because of the movement of the connector will contact and lacerate the adjacent soft tissues. But if the anterior ridge, we said here, if there is vertical dropout or there is a slope, but if the anterior ridge is undercut by its own, sufficient space may be created when the technician block out the undercut. During the blockout procedure, as we described previously, we said if there is undercut, it should be block out by blockout wax. So the blockout here will be enough for preventing the contact between the lower major connector and the soft tissue. As we see here in this figure, this area represents the space for the relief procedure because the anterior ridge in this area, there is a slope between the soft tissues and the tongue space. Tissue stops. Tissue stops represent as 2 mm by 2 mm square cut. What is this square cut? Square cut in the wax, in the relief wax that we used, as we said previously, over the ridge in case of distal extension areas. In the distal extension areas, if we do a space or square cut in the relief wax, we will create a tissue stops. The tissue stops, as we see here, in the terminal part of the metal framework, represent integral part for the minor connector. This minor connector designed for the retention of acrylic resin denture base. In the ladder area, this minor connector is an integral part for the retention of the acrylic resin during the design of removable partial denture, and the tissue stop is an integral part for this minor connector. So, By holding the retention area of the framework, the retentive ladder, away, this metal stop will hold this metal framework away from the tissue for the purpose of creating space while the packing force is being applied in order to create the sufficient space for the entrance of the acrylic resin. Now, the final part is the spacer. Spacer is similar to the tissue stops. The purpose here for the spacer is different from the purpose of the tissue stop, but the spacer serves to be similar to the tissue stop, but again the action of the spacer is different from the tissue stop. The properly formed internal finish line. What we mean by internal finish line is the line that will form a butt joint between the metal framework and the acrylic resin denture base. So that means that both of the spacer and the tissue stops, their action is related to the acrylic resin denture base. But here the purpose is different. Tissue stops used to create a space for the packing of the acrylic resin denture base and holding the retentive metal framework away from the tissues. The spacer is, for example, the internal finish line used to create a definitive butt joint between the metal framework from one side and the acrylic resin denture base from the other side. Now, type of the spacer is the finish line. As a rule, the finish line should be placed 1.5 millimeter from the neighboring abutment or abutments. There should be space between 1.5 millimeter from the neighboring abutment. This distance will ensure that the porous resin will not come into direct contact with the marginal gingiva. That means there will be a space between the marginal gingiva and the acrylic resin, which is in its nature will be porous, so there will be a space created by this spacer. Thank you for your kind listening.